Okay, this is Business 342, page 81, homework problem number 9. A pension manager is considering 3 mutual funds for an investment. The first one's a stock fund, the second one's a bond fund, and the third one's a money market fund. The money market fund yields a risk-free return of 4%. The inputs for the risky funds are given below. So they listed these two. These are the risky funds, but I always listed down below the risk-free fund, which has an expected return of 4%. And remember, a risk-free fund has 0 standard deviation. Standard deviation represents a measure of risk. So if it's a risk-free fund, it has no risk. That's why it's called a risk-free fund, and its standard deviation is 0. And also they mentioned down here below that a correlation, it talks about the correlation between the stock fund and the bond funds is 0.2. It doesn't say anything about a correlation between a risk-free fund, and that's because there is no correlation between a risk-free fund or a risk-free asset and a risky asset. There's 0 correlation. So risk-free funds have a 0 standard deviation because there's no risk, and they have no correlation with risky funds. Okay, so for A, it says, what is the expected return of the variance, expected return and a variance of a portfolio? So they want the expected return of the portfolio and the variance of portfolio that invests 60% in the stock fund and 40% in the bond fund. So they're just asking you for these first two, what's the expected return and what's the variance. Now to figure those out, there's a couple different formulas you use depending on the information that you're given. One formula you use has to do with when you're given a probability. There's no probability given here, but this is given a standard deviation, and this is given a correlation. So we can use a formula related to that. The one that has to do with probability, the formula for that is the variance of the variance of return of a portfolio equals the return of asset 1 minus the expected return of the portfolio squared times the probability of the return of that asset plus the return of asset minus, this is just giving you the variance squared, you're squaring these, the return of asset 2 minus the expected return of the portfolio, that gives you the difference between mu and x, right, squared times the probability of the return, or the probability of the return for asset 2, and then so on and so forth. You just keep adding these. This is for out of your workbooks. So in this case, you were given a probability, you were given returns, you were given weights. Those are all the information you need to do it this one way. You figure out the expected return, then you figure out the variance with the formula just talked about, and then the standard deviation. That's when you're given the probability and the weights and the returns. In this case, you're not given that information, but you're given some additional information. You're given standard deviations and you're given correlations. So you use a different formula that was also in your workbook, and that's this one right here. And I'll make this a little bit bigger, and I'll tell you what page this is on too. I think that's on page 71 or something. The variance of the portfolio, the standard deviation squared, equals the weight of asset A squared times the standard deviation squared for asset A plus the weight of asset B squared times the standard deviation of B squared plus 2 times the weight of A times the weight of B times the covariance of A and B, or the same formula except when you get the 2 times the weight of A and 2 times the weight of B, you get the correlation of A and B times the standard deviation of A and B. They've given you the standard deviation of A and B. They've given you the correlation between those two. So you're going to use this part of the formula to figure out the variance. And that's on page 70, I think 71, or excuse me. I've actually got it right here. It's on page 71 of your workbook. And here's that formula again. And this is on page 71 of your workbook under Portfolio Mathematics. Okay, so we're going to use that formula to figure out the variance of the portfolio and the expected return. So the first thing you need to do is figure out the expected return of the portfolio. And the expected return of asset A, or the portfolio, that's a P, is the weight of A times the return of A. So in this case, they told you that we're going to go with the 60% in stock fund and 40% in the bond fund. Okay? So if you put weight up here, it's 60% and 40%. Okay? And that would be right there. Okay, so the expected return is 14% times 0.6. Expected return of the portfolio is the weight of A, which is 60%, times 14. Remember, they don't put it 0.4. They put it as a whole number, so it comes out as a whole number over here. So when you're doing the percentages for a return, just keep them as a whole number. So 0.6, which this is basically just a weighted average when you're figuring out this expected return. Okay, so the expected return is a weighted average. 6/10 of it at 14%, 4/10 of it at 8%, and it comes out to your expected return is 11.6%. Okay, so that's the first part of what you needed to figure out. Now the next part, we're going to use that variance formula for the portfolio. Okay, so the variance of the return of the portfolio equals the standard deviation squared, and that's that formula, the weight squared times the standard deviation squared, so of stock fund A, and the weight squared, remember this is 0.6 and 0.4, times the standard deviation squared, and here's the second part of the formula, plus 2 times the weight of A times the weight of B, and then the rest of that is times the correlation. So remember, they gave you the correlation of 0.2 times the standard deviation of A and B. Okay, and that's this formula again that I showed you earlier. That's on page 71 of your workbook. Okay, and this is when they give you standard deviations and correlations, but they don't give you the probabilities. You use this formula. Okay, so then you go ahead and figure that out, multiply, add, and everything, and you get that the variance is 309.66, and we already figured out the expected return 11.6. So the expected return 11.6, the variance is 309.66. Okay, so now they're asking you to figure out the same thing for the risk-free fund. It says, what is the expected return in the variance for the portfolio that's 60% in stock and 40% in the money market fund? So now this would be 40% down here. And you really wouldn't have this at that point. So 1640. Okay. So you go through with the same formulas. The expected return of the portfolio is the weighted average, 0.6 times 14%, 0.4 times 4%. That's 10% is the expected return. Now you go through with that same formula to figure out the variance. The variance is the weight squared times the standard deviation squared plus the weight squared times the standard deviation squared. Well, remember, there's no standard deviation for a risk-free fund. This has to do with the risk-free fund. So this whole thing is going to add up to 0, right? Okay, and then the last part of that formula is 2 times the weight of the stock fund and the weight of the risk-free fund, and it's times the correlation. Well, remember, there is no correlation between a risk-free fund and a stock fund or a bond fund, so that's 0. Also times the standard deviation of the stock fund, which is 26, but 0 for the risk-free asset, because remember, there is no standard deviation. So there's no correlation, no standard deviation, so this ends up to be 0. So the variance of the portfolio actually just equals the variance of the stock fund in this case, because the risk-free fund zeroes out, because there is no variance when you have no standard deviation and no correlation. You don't have to worry about the correlation. There is no, well, it zeroes out over here because of the standard deviation also. So remember, when you have a risk-free fund, and in this case there's just two funds, one with risk and one without, the variance is just going to be due to the stock fund that has a standard deviation, because there is no standard deviation in the risk-free fund. So the variance equals that, which works out to be 243.36, which is equal to the variance of the stock fund. So that's the answer for, that's a long one, but that was kind of a little bit involved. So that's problem number 9 on page 81.